Imagine being Anakin Skywalker. You're the chosen one, the prophecy guy. You've won more battles than most Jedi see in a lifetime, trained a padawan to knighthood, and lost an arm fighting a Sith Lord. And then Mace Windu looks you dead in the eye and tells you to take a seat because you're not ready for master rank. Now imagine finding out that a bunny cat with color-changing fur got master rank 400 years before you were born. A fluffy little creature, half a meter tall, floppy ears, a tail that would make a housecat jealous, trained personally by Yoda and promoted to the highest honor in the Jedi Order. While Anakin was being told he needed to demonstrate more patience, this adorable bundle of mood ring fur had already waited 4 centuries beside an ancient artifact without complaining once. But we'll get back to the bunny cat, because the rabbit hole goes so much deeper than Anakin ever knew. The Jedi Order existed for over 25,000 years before Anakin threw his tantrum in that council chamber. And in that time, they gave master rank to beings that would make Anakin's grievance look less like righteous indignation and more like a toddler who didn't get dessert before dinner. Beings without hands, beings without lungs, beings that other Jedi literally mistook for animals upon first meeting. One of them was a literal tree. This is the prosecution of Anakin Skywalker's ego. The evidence. 10 Jedi Masters so bizarre, so unexpected, and so fundamentally insulting to everything Anakin believed about his own specialness that his fall to the dark side starts to look less like tragedy and more like the galaxy's most predictable tantrum. Court is now in session. 5,000 years before Anakin Skywalker existed, the Jedi Council had already established that physical form meant nothing when it came to spiritual mastery. The proof floated in a specialized containment tank filled with cyanogen gas, a compound that would kill most oxygen-breathing species almost instantly. Uru was a collegian. Picture this: a massive brain surrounded by delicate tentacles, suspended in an atmosphere so poisonous it would kill most oxygen-breathing species in seconds. The collegians evolved in environments where cyanogen was as natural as oxygen is to humans, and without it, they couldn't survive. Uru couldn't exist in the same room as his students without murdering them, couldn't shake hands, couldn't spar with a training saber, couldn't sit in a council chamber without his specialized tank, couldn't do any of the things Anakin considered essential to being a Jedi warrior. The council looked at this brain in a tank of poison and said yes. Uru trained Odan, one of the most celebrated Jedi scholars in galactic history, a being who would go on to shape Jedi philosophy for millennia. That alone would have been legacy enough for most masters. But Uru's final act during the Great Hyperspace War in 5000 BBY transformed him from teacher to legend. The Sith Empire had come. Not the diminished remnants that Anakin would eventually join, but the original Sith, an empire of dark side practitioners who commanded fleets and armies and threatened to consume the Republic entirely. When their forces attacked Kirik, the situation became desperate. Jedi and Republic soldiers fought side by side against overwhelming numbers, and Uru made a calculation that no one else could have made. His cyanogen atmosphere, the gas that kept him alive, the poisonous cloud that separated him from every other being in the galaxy. He released it. Uru opened his containment tank and let the cyanogen pour out across the battlefield. The gas that sustained his massive brain body became a weapon of last resort, killing Sith warriors by the dozens as they choked on an atmosphere they couldn't have anticipated. Uru passed into the Force in that moment, not because he was struck down, but because he gave away the very substance that allowed him to exist, a brain, in a tank, of poison gas, sacrificing itself not through lightsaber combat or dramatic force powers, but through the simple act of sharing its environment with enemies who couldn't survive it. 5,000 years before Anakin complained about his treatment, the Jedi Council had already established that master rank required this kind of selflessness. Not power, not prophecy, not being the special boy who was promised to bring balance. Just the willingness to give everything, including your own biological necessity, for others. Anakin never managed that. Not really. His sacrifices always came wrapped in attachment, in possession, in the desperate need to control outcomes. Uru controlled nothing in his final moment, except the valve on his own tank. 1,000 years after Uru's sacrifice, the Council continued its tradition of honoring beings that most people would mistake for dangerous wildlife. Thawn was a Chuktai, and describing this species requires you to abandon every assumption you have about what a Jedi Master should look like. Massive quadrupeds, armored hide thick enough to deflect blaster bolts, bestial faces with jaws that could crush durasteel, the kind of creature you'd expect to find charging at you in a nightmare, rather than teaching you about the subtleties of Force meditation. When the legendary Jedi Nomi Sunrider first encountered Thawn on Ambria around 4000 BBY, she assumed he was a beast of burden, maybe a guard animal, possibly a threat to be defended against with the lightsaber she'd been reluctant to ignite. She was spectacularly wrong. Thawn was one of the most powerful and wise Jedi Masters of his era, operating from a remote homestead on Ambria where he had chosen to live in apparent simplicity. His home planet was drenched in dark side energy, the result of ancient Sith experiments, and Thawn had spent years containing that darkness through pure meditation. Not fighting it, not destroying it, just holding it in place through the strength of his connection to the Force. He trained Nomi Sunrider herself, guiding her from a reluctant widow who feared the Force into a woman who would become Grand Master of the entire Jedi Order. The future leader of all Jedi, the highest position any Force user could achieve, owed her development to a being that other Jedi literally thought was an animal when they first met him. Think about what Thawn couldn't do by conventional standards. He didn't have hands designed for grip. Holding a lightsaber in the traditional sense was impossible. He couldn't wear Jedi robes in any recognizable fashion. He communicated primarily through the Force and gestures, rather than spoken basic. He couldn't attend formal council sessions without causing panic among visitors who might mistake him for an escaped zoo specimen. Everything about his physical form suggested he was unsuited for Jedi training. The council gave master rank to a being that other Jedi mistook for an animal. They declined to give it to Anakin, who mistook his own power for worthiness. There's something almost poetic about that comparison. Anakin believed that looking the part, human, handsome, capable of dramatic lightsaber flourishes, should count for something. Thawn proved that looking the part meant nothing. The Force doesn't care if you have opposable thumbs. The Force doesn't care if other beings scream when they first see you. The Force cares about what's inside. And what was inside Thawn was wisdom that Anakin couldn't have accessed with 1,000 years of training. Because Anakin never stopped looking at surfaces, never stopped caring about appearances, about recognition, about being seen as the hero. Thawn spent his life being seen as a monster by everyone who didn't know better, and he achieved mastery anyway. And now we arrive at the title character, the tree. Bnar was a neti, a species of photosynthetic, plant-based sentience, capable of shapeshifting between humanoid forms and their natural tree states. They could live for thousands of years. They drew sustenance from sunlight rather than food, and they produced Jedi Masters who make Anakin's Chosen One narrative look like a participation trophy handed out at a youth sports league. During the Great Sith War around 4000 BBY, the Sith Lord Exar Kun launched an assault that would devastate the Jedi for generations. His target? Ossus, the library world where the Order kept its most precious knowledge. Scrolls dating back millennia, holocrons containing the wisdom of masters long passed into the Force, artifacts of immense power and historical significance. When the attack came, Bnar did something that would make any arborist weep with joy. He transformed into his tree form and literally rooted himself over a cache of precious Jedi lightsabers and artifacts, hiding them beneath his wooden body. His bark grew thick, his roots dug deep, his leaves spread wide enough to look like just another tree in a landscape full of devastation. Then he stayed there, for 4,000 years. Think about what that means. Not 4 years, not 40, not 400, though we'll get to someone who managed that shortly. 4,000 years of standing motionless in a blasted landscape. The Republic rose to its greatest heights and fell to the Sith. Bnar stood. The Sith ate themselves through infighting and nearly went extinct. Bnar stood. The Republic rebuilt itself, stronger than before. Bnar stood. The Clone Wars erupted across the galaxy, millions dying in a conflict that would end the Republic forever. Bnar stood. The Galactic Empire hunted Jedi to extinction, Order 66 claiming thousands of lives. Bnar stood. The rebellion rose and the Empire fell. Bnar stood. Empires were born and died. Species achieved spaceflight and went extinct. The entire political structure of the galaxy transformed multiple times. And a tree stood guard over some lightsabers, because a Jedi Master had decided they were worth protecting. What happened when Bnar finally awakened? What he did after 4 millennia of vigil? The explosive confrontation that ended his watch? That's a story worth discovering if you're curious enough to dig into the legend's continuity. The full narrative is more dramatic than anything I could summarize here. But here's what matters for this prosecution. A literal tree demonstrated more emotional stability than the Chosen One. A tree that couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but wait and trust in the Force, achieved a patience that Anakin couldn't muster for 10 minutes in a council chamber. When Mace Windu told Anakin to take a seat, Anakin's response was immediate outrage. "This is outrageous. It's unfair." He couldn't even wait to leave the room before throwing his tantrum. Couldn't even maintain the appearance of acceptance for the duration of a single conversation. Bnar maintained his vigil through 4,000 years of silence. The tree won at being a Jedi, just absolutely demolished the concept. And somewhere in those Jedi archives that Anakin walked past every day, there were probably records of Bnar's accomplishment. Records Anakin never bothered to read because he was too busy thinking about his own destiny. Now we return to the bunny cat. Because Ikrit deserves the full spotlight, and because his story is the one that would make Anakin's Force ghost scream into the void, if ghosts could scream. The Kushiban were a species from the planet Kushiba, and describing them requires you to accept that the Force works in mysterious and occasionally adorable ways. Small, roughly half a meter tall at most, long floppy ears that actually flopped when they moved, a tail that would make any lothcat jealous, and fur that changed colors based on emotional state, like a mood ring had achieved sentience and decided to become a Jedi. White meant calm and contemplative. Red meant anger. Golden meant joy. Various other shades communicated the full spectrum of fluffy feelings. You could literally watch a Kushiban's emotional journey play out across their fur in real time. Ikrit was trained personally by Yoda during the height of the Old Republic, centuries before Anakin was even a biological possibility. He achieved master rank, went on galaxy-spanning adventures, discovered ancient artifacts, earned the respect of Jedi across the Order. And then, around 386 BBY, roughly 4 centuries before the Clone Wars, he found the Golden Globe on Yavin 4. The Golden Globe was a Force artifact of immense power, and its contents were tragic beyond measure. Trapped inside were the souls of Massassi children, victims of Sith experiments thousands of years earlier, who had never been able to pass into the Force. They existed in a state of suspended anguish, neither alive nor dead, waiting for someone to free them. Ikrit studied the globe, meditated on it, reached out through the Force to understand its mechanism. And he discovered something that would have broken lesser beings. Only children could break the curse. The innocence required to free the trapped souls was something no adult could provide, no matter how powerful. If Ikrit attempted to free them himself, he would destroy both the artifact and the souls within. 400 years of tortured children would be annihilated because he was too old to save them. Most beings would have raged against this. Most beings would have tried anyway, or searched desperately for loopholes, or spent their remaining years in frustrated obsession. Ikrit made a vow. He would wait. This furry little creature, small enough to fit in a large handbag, entered a meditative state and simply waited beside the Golden Globe. not using the Force overtly. He had vowed not to until the children were freed. Not igniting his lightsaber. Just patiently trusting that the right children would eventually come. He waited through the fall of the Old Republic. He waited through the rise of the Empire. He waited through the Galactic Civil War. He waited while the Death Star was built, destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again. He was still waiting when Luke Skywalker established his new Jedi Order on Yavin 4, meditating in the ruins of Massassi temples while a new generation of Jedi trained above him. 400 years. A bunny cat with mood ring fur, waiting beside an artifact he couldn't touch, trusting in a future he might never see. And here's the part that connects directly to Anakin's legacy. The children who finally fulfilled the prophecy and freed the Massassi souls were Anakin Solo and Tahiri Vela. Yes, that Anakin Solo, named after his grandfather. The original Anakin's namesake grandson was mentored by a bunny cat who had waited 4 centuries with more patience than Anakin managed in his entire life. Ikrit emerged from his self-imposed exile specifically to guide these children. He became their teacher, their protector, their example of what Jedi patience actually looked like. The lessons he taught young Anakin Solo were the lessons that the original Anakin had refused to learn. Ikrit died heroically during the Yuzon Vong War around 26 ABY, sacrificing himself to save his young friends from enemies who threatened everything he cared about. A death with purpose, a death with meaning, a death that stood in stark contrast to Anakin Skywalker's decade-long tenure as Darth Vader, a wheezing life support system serving a master he grew to hate. When Anakin complained that his treatment was unfair, what he really meant was that he deserved special consideration because he was powerful, because he was the chosen one, because he had suffered. Ikrit suffered too. 4 centuries of waiting beside an artifact he couldn't touch, watching over trapped souls he couldn't save, his fur probably cycling through every shade of patient blue-white as the years became decades, became centuries. And Ikrit didn't complain. Ikrit meditated about it like an adult. The bunny cat won at being a Jedi, and Anakin's own grandson learned more from that fluffy creature than he ever could have learned from his infamous grandfather. If the bunny cat wasn't insulting enough to Anakin's ego, consider that one of his fellow council members, seated in the same chamber where Anakin was told to take a seat, was a being whose lower body was several meters of coiled snake. Oppo Rancysus was a Thespiasian, born around 206 BBY, making him well over 200 years old during the Clone Wars. His species possessed humanoid upper bodies attached to massive serpentine tails. Imagine a centaur, but instead of a horse's body, it's a giant coiled serpent that probably required specially designed furniture and raised endless questions about Jedi robe tailoring. Rancysus achieved master rank centuries before Anakin was born, and his specialty was something that made individual combat prowess almost irrelevant: battle meditation. This rare force technique allowed him to influence the morale and coordination of entire armies across vast distances. While Anakin was charging into battle and losing limbs through individual heroics, the flashy, recognizable kind of bravery that gets you noticed, Rancysus was supporting Republic forces through spiritual warfare that no one could see or photograph. His contributions didn't make for good holonet footage. There were no dramatic lightsaber duels, no last-second rescues, no moments where Rancysus could demonstrate his power in ways that would impress casual observers. He simply sat in meditation, while hundreds of kilometers away, clone troopers found their aim steadying and their courage strengthening through means they couldn't identify. The Council valued that wisdom. They valued the ability to serve without recognition, to strengthen others without taking credit, to use the Force for collective benefit rather than individual glory. A snake. They gave it to a snake. Rancysus held master rank for longer than Anakin was alive, contributing to battles Anakin never knew about, serving in ways Anakin would have found boring and beneath him. Rancysus died in 19 BBY during the Battle of Seleucami, assassinated by the Dark Jedi Sora Bulk, a tragic end to a distinguished career that had nothing to do with Order 66 or Anakin's betrayal. He died having served the Order in ways that Anakin never understood and never appreciated. A snake, doing the quiet work that held the Republic together. The prosecution now presents evidence so visually absurd it strains the very concept of Jedi dignity. Yarael Poof was a Quermian Jedi Master whose neck was approximately half his total body height. The Quermians looked like someone had stretched a humanoid through a taffy puller and then given the result a second brain to compensate for the distance between head and body. Yarael Poof possessed an elongated skull, an impossibly long neck that swayed when he moved, 4 arms hidden beneath his robes, and 2 brains, one in his head and one in his chest cavity, that allowed for enhanced cognitive function and telepathic communication with other Quermians. This noodle-necked being served on the Jedi High Council during the final decades of the Republic. He sat in that circular chamber and contributed to decisions about the Order's future, his impossibly long neck presumably requiring a specially designed chair. When the Council debated policy, when they discussed the fate of young Anakin Skywalker and whether to train him despite his age, Yarael Poof was there. His 2 brains were processing the implications, while Anakin's single brain was still struggling with basic emotional regulation. Yarael Poof died in 27 BBY, roughly 5 years before the Clone Wars began, during a mission to stop a terrorist from deploying a deadly artifact on Coruscant. His death was heroic. He gave his life to save billions. But it occurred so far from the main narrative that most Star Wars fans have no idea he existed. He's not mentioned in the films after The Phantom Menace. His sacrifice didn't make the history books that Anakin would have read. But the record stands. The noodle got it. The noodle was on the council first. While Anakin was still a padawan learning to control his emotions, a being with 2 brains and a neck longer than most humans are tall, had already achieved everything Anakin wanted, and died protecting a planet Anakin would later help enslave. Coleman Trebor was a Verk, a saurian species that looked like someone gave a Parasaurolophus the ability to walk upright and vote on Jedi policy. Tall, with elongated head crests and dinosaur-like features, the Verk evolved on the planet Sembla and were known for diplomatic abilities and calm temperaments. They were natural mediators, and Coleman Trebor embodied that heritage. Coleman Trebor served on the Jedi High Council, Master rank, a seat at the highest table in Jedi governance. He had earned his position through decades of service, through diplomatic missions that prevented wars, through the quiet work of negotiation that never made for exciting stories, but saved countless lives. His death is what earns him a place in this prosecution. During the Battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY, the opening engagement of the Clone Wars, where Anakin also fought, the situation in the arena had become desperate. Jedi were dying. The Separatist forces had them surrounded, and Coleman Trebor, Jedi Master and Council member, saw an opportunity. Count Dooku stood on a balcony overlooking the carnage. If Trebor could reach him, could defeat him, the battle might end in moments. It was the kind of bold, aggressive action that Anakin would have applauded, the kind of decisive move that Anakin believed the Jedi needed more of. Trebor leaped toward the Separatist leader with his lightsaber drawn. Jango Fett shot him. Multiple times. The bolts hit Trebor in midair, and the Jedi Master fell from the balcony in approximately 3 seconds of screen time. He hit the arena floor and didn't get up. A dinosaur Jedi Master, Council member, diplomatic genius who had talked his way out of more conflicts than Anakin could count, shot down by a bounty hunter before finishing a single leap. The Council gave Master rank and a council seat to a dinosaur who died that quickly, who tried the bold, aggressive action and paid the ultimate price for it. They did not give Master rank to Anakin, who survived that same battle, who went on to win countless engagements afterward, who was standing right there, watching Trebor fall, and probably thinking he would have done it better. A dinosaur. The dinosaur got it. Anakin watched the dinosaur get shot, and still couldn't get promoted. And maybe, just maybe, that's because the Council understood something Anakin never did, that success in a single moment doesn't prove anything. Trebor died because he made a mistake, but his lifetime of service earned him his rank. Anakin's lifetime of service was still too short, too volatile, too defined by the very impulsiveness that got Trebor killed. Kit Fisto was a nautilin, fully amphibious, evolved on the water world of Glee Anselm, capable of breathing underwater indefinitely, equipped with head tentacles that could detect pheromones and emotional states in the water around him. His species had abilities that most Jedi couldn't imagine, sensory perceptions that operated in dimensions humans couldn't access. Kit Fisto is best remembered for his genuinely charming smile during the Battle of Geonosis, a grin captured during combat that became iconic because it showed something rare among the dour Jedi of that era: genuine enjoyment. He seemed to actually like being a Jedi, not the burden of it, not the destiny of it, just the simple joy of wielding a lightsaber and making a difference. Kit Fisto developed his own variation of Form 1 lightsaber combat, adapted for underwater fighting, allowing him to engage enemies in environments where most Jedi would drown before they could ignite their sabers. His head tentacles weren't just decorative, they were sensory organs that gave him awareness most Jedi couldn't match. He could sense emotional states through water. He could fight in 3 dimensions, while his opponents struggled with basic buoyancy. The Council looked at an amphibian with head tentacles who could literally sense emotions through water and said yes. They gave him master rank and a council seat. Kit Fisto died in 19 BBY, the same year Anakin threw his tantrum, when he accompanied Mace Windu to arrest Chancellor Palpatine. He was cut down by Sidious in that cramped office, his exceptional abilities useless against a Sith Lord who moved faster than anyone expected. His death was neither dignified nor meaningful. He simply wasn't fast enough. An amphibian with sensory tentacles and underwater combat mastery got master rank. Anakin, who could only sense emotions through the normal force methods available to everyone, who couldn't breathe underwater, who never developed a unique combat form suited to his specific abilities, did not. And then Anakin helped kill the rest of them. Tarasa was another Neti, another tree person, a female Neti Jedi Master who served the Order during the final centuries of the Galactic Republic, and whose mere existence should have been a daily reminder to Anakin that his grievances were petty. She drew sustenance from sunlight. She could shapeshift between humanoid and arboreal forms. She had likely lived for centuries before Anakin was born, and would likely live for centuries after he died. The Neti experienced time differently than humans. A decade to them was barely a season. A century was a reasonable career arc, and a millennium was the kind of time frame in which they made their most significant decisions. Tarasa served alongside beings like Mace Windu as equals. When the Council made decisions about the Order's future, her perspective, the perspective of a being who had watched civilizations rise and fall while standing in one place, was considered valuable. She had seen the Republic go through multiple constitutional crises. She had watched the Jedi Order cycle through periods of expansion and contraction. Her wisdom came from a timescale that human Jedi couldn't access, and she held master rank. A tree person who photosynthesized for sustenance and experienced decades as humans experience months, held the same rank that Anakin was denied. The Council valued her perspective precisely because it was so different from their own, so removed from the urgency and impatience that defined human lifespans. When Anakin demanded recognition for 13 years of service, he was operating on a human timescale that the Council didn't entirely share. They had members who measured time in centuries. They had seen promising Jedi rise and fall across generations. 13 years was nothing to them, barely enough time for a Neti to notice the seasons changing. That's not an excuse for their rigidity, but it does explain why "Take a seat, young Skywalker" hit differently than Anakin realized. To beings who lived for millennia, he was young. Unbearably, obviously, dangerously young. And his inability to understand that, his insistence that his subjective experience of time should matter more than theirs, was exactly why he wasn't ready. The final exhibit requires careful framing, because this one's tricky. Sharad Hett looked like a Tusken raider. Dressed like one, fought like one, wore the wrappings and breathed through the filters, and moved through the desert the way only Tuskens could. But here's what matters. He was genetically human. His father, Sharad Hett, was a Jedi Knight who left the Order and settled among the Tuskens on Tatooine, eventually becoming a warlord among them. He found something in Tusken culture that the Jedi Order couldn't provide: community, family, a sense of belonging that didn't require celibacy or emotional detachment. He married. He had a son. He raised that son in Tusken traditions. Sharad was raised in Tusken culture from birth. Their language, their traditions, their warrior training, their deep spiritual connection to the desert. He learned to survive in the Dune Sea before he learned to read Basic. He understood the Tuskens not as the savage raiders that most colonizers saw, but as a complex society with its own laws and honor. The Tuskens who appeared in recent stories about Boba Fett, their rituals, their combat styles, their deep connection to Tatooine's harsh landscape. Sharad embodied all of that while also wielding the Force. He was proof that Tusken culture could produce warriors as disciplined and spiritual as any Jedi. He became a Jedi Knight during the Clone Wars, served alongside Anakin multiple times, wore his Tusken garments into battle alongside Jedi robes, honoring both traditions simultaneously. His later story involves a transformation into something much darker. The Yuuzhan Vong War broke him in ways that decades of combat hadn't. What he became afterward, that's a tale for another time. A story of corruption and redemption that spans more years than Anakin ever lived. What matters here is the irony. The Jedi Order accepted a human raised entirely in Tusken culture, trained in their warrior traditions, wearing their masks and robes. They saw past the surface to the person beneath. They recognized that being raised by Tuskens didn't make Sharad a Tusken, but it did give him a unique perspective that the Order valued. And yet, when Anakin, who grew up as a slave on the same planet where Tuskens lived, who had his own complicated relationship with Tatooine's indigenous people, who slaughtered an entire Tusken village in a rage and never faced consequences, asked for recognition, the Council couldn't extend him the same understanding. The Jedi Council accepted a Tusken-raised warrior and rejected the boy who murdered Tuskens in their sleep. There's probably a lesson there about what the Council actually valued, but Anakin never learned it. So what have we established through this prosecution? The Jedi Council gave master rank to a brain floating in poison gas, a dinosaur-looking creature that other Jedi mistook for an animal, a literal tree that stood motionless for 4,000 years, protecting lightsabers no one asked him to guard, a bunny cat with mood ring fur who waited 4 centuries beside an artifact he couldn't touch, a being whose lower body was several meters of coiled snake, a noodle-necked Quermian with 2 brains, a dinosaur who got shot trying to be a hero, an amphibian with emotional sensing head tentacles, another tree who experienced centuries the way humans experience decades. Every single one of them demonstrated something Anakin couldn't: patience, trust in the Force, the ability to accept that the galaxy didn't owe them anything just because they were powerful. Anakin was 23 years old when he threw his tantrum in that council chamber. He'd been a Jedi for 13 years. He thought that was long enough. He thought his power entitled him to recognition. He thought being the chosen one meant the rules shouldn't apply to him. Ikrit waited 400 years beside the Golden Globe without complaint, his fur cycling through calm colors while he trusted in a future he couldn't see. Bnar stood as a tree for 4 millennia, protecting knowledge through the rise and fall of empires. Uru communicated through the Force because he couldn't even breathe the same air as his students, and he gave away that air to save others. These weren't powerful beings who demanded recognition for their power. They were beings who earned recognition through service, through patience, through the understanding that being a Jedi wasn't about what the Order could give you. It was about what you could give the Order. Anakin never understood that. He counted his battles won, his enemies defeated, his limbs lost in service. He kept a ledger of his sacrifices and presented it to the Council like an invoice. Pay me what I'm owed. Recognize my suffering. Make me master. The council looked at that ledger and compared it to a tree who had waited 4,000 years without asking for anything. Compared it to a bunny cat who had spent 4 centuries in meditation, rather than demand the recognition he'd already earned. Compared it to a brain in poison gas who had given his very atmosphere to save others. Anakin's ledger came up short. The Jedi Council's weird choices weren't the problem. Their willingness to see past physical form, past conventional timelines, past every surface-level measure of worthiness, that was the Order at its best. That was what made them Jedi, rather than just a guild of Force users with glowing swords. Anakin's ego was the problem. Always was. His inability to see past his own suffering. His conviction that his power made him special. His refusal to wait, to trust, to accept that wisdom couldn't be rushed. And that's why his tantrum hits different when you realize a literal tree had more emotional stability than the chosen one. Subscribe for more stories like this.